Alaska, law enforcement has been using DNA to identify people for over 20 years. They use DNA to prove suspects were at specific locations during particular time frames. DNA is very important in many homicide and sex crime cases. DNA is also used to confirm the identities of unidentified human remains. The technology associated with creating DNA profiles has advanced tremendously over the past 20 years. Initially, only 2 DNA samples could be directly compared to see if they were an exact match. Eventually, samples yielded profiles that could be digitized and stored in a nationwide database known as CODIS. The profiles in the database are compared to DNA profiles found at crime scenes and collected from victims to identify specific individuals. Over time, the process has greatly improved, requiring smaller amounts of DNA to obtain results with higher degrees of accuracy. However, CODIS does have its limitations. If a particular individual has never been required to put their DNA profile into CODIS, no identification can be made. Recently, law enforcement has turned to a new type of forensic DNA analysis called genetic genealogy that utilizes a different type of DNA profile than what is used in CODIS. The process of creating the DNA profile involves multiple specialty labs. The profile is then uploaded into public genealogical databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, which include tens of thousands of DNA profiles. Once the profile is found to be related to one or more people, genealogy researchers begin building a family tree to narrow the list of potential suspects. In the spring of 2018, the Alaska State Troopers Cold Case Unit became aware of the genetic genealogy process. In Washington State, the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office made the news when they solved a 1987 double homicide using genetic genealogy. Prosecutors were eventually able to convict William Earl Tabbitt II for the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenburg. California detectives revealed that just a month earlier they had used the same process to research and find relatives of Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, who committed 13 murders and more than 50 rapes across California in the 1970s and 80s. Once they narrowed their search to DeAngelo, they acquired a DNA sample to confirm they had found the right person. Alaska State Troopers investigator Randy McFerrin says the cold case unit has now used genetic genealogy to find suspects in 3 cold case murders, including the case in which Jessica Baggin was raped and murdered by Steve Branch in 1996.
Yeah, I don't see it either.
2 additional cold cases in which they used this process are still under investigation. Very recently, using genetic genealogy, the Alaska State Troopers were able to discover the identity of one of serial killer Robert Hanson's victims.
She was nicknamed Horseshoe Harriet. Her body was found in April of '84 out by Horseshoe Lake, which is near the mouth of the Susitna River.
Hanson killed her in 1983. Once he was caught, as part of his plea bargain, he identified the location of her body and a few others. The medical examiner's office made dental records, and then she was buried at the Anchorage Cemetery as a Jane Doe. With the advent of DNA analysis, she was exhumed in 2014 to collect a DNA sample from her remains. Her profile was uploaded into the FBI's National Missing Persons database in 2015, but no matches were found. In 2020, a different type of profile was created from the 2014 samples, and her profile was uploaded into a public genetic genealogy database in August 2021. A family tree was developed and identified a possible match to Horseshoe Harriet. After interviewing some of her newly discovered relatives and doing further research, the cold case unit was able to find a very close relative and obtained a DNA sample. The DNA sample provided by the close relative compared with the sample from the victim's remains confirmed their relationship. Horseshoe Harriet is actually Robin Pelkey. The Alaska State Troopers Bureau of Investigation Cold Case Investigation Unit is currently working on identifying the first of Hanson's victims.
Today we exhumed the remains of a young woman who was killed back in 1979. She's colloquially known as Eklutna Annie. Her body was found in 1980 along a power line trail by Eklutna Lake Road to the east of Anchorage. She is one of the victims of serial killer Robert Hanson. He confessed to her murder, claimed that she was his first murder victim, and it occurred sometime in the fall of 1979. In 2003, the remains were exhumed to collect a DNA sample from her bones. They were able to generate a DNA profile to put in the National Missing Persons Database, but unfortunately there's been no hits from that database. So now we're trying a different method that involves a different type of DNA profile. The samples we had degraded over time, so we needed to collect new samples to try this process again.
Hopefully we'll be able to get a good sample, upload it ultimately into GEDmatch and or FTDNA, and be able to build her family tree and find out who she is and get some closure for her family.
The entire process and the effort to identify Eklutna Annie could take from 6 months to a year. Meanwhile, the unit is also working on a case of the unidentified human remains of a man who appears to be of Guatemalan descent. His remains were found near Clara Creek, near Coldfoot, Alaska. The unit did have a DNA profile developed from his remains, but have only found distantly related individuals, which makes developing a usable family tree difficult. From the DNA data, one of the labs was able to generate an image of what the man might have looked like. This is not a photo, but a genetic prediction of his appearance. They do know, from his remains, that his hair was 6 inches long and that it was darker at one end and lighter at the other. Other than some of the clothing he was wearing, no other belongings were found. If you or someone you know knows who this individual was, please let troopers know. Contact AST Cold Cases at 907-373-7728 or the Missing Persons Clearinghouse at 907-269-5038. If anyone might be interested in learning more about their own family tree, the process for creating an account is pretty simple. The genetic genealogy website you select will send you a kit. You send them a swab or vial of saliva. You then use their online tools to find close and distant relatives. It's very interesting to find out in many cases where your ancestors originated. You can use the private companies and their websites, or you can upload your DNA profile to the public databases at GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. In the past few years, genetic genealogy has developed into a tremendous forensic tool for the Alaska State Troopers to identify both the perpetrators of unsolved homicides and their unidentified victims. This great leap forward would not be possible without the assistance of the courageous private citizens who have placed their DNA profiles in the genealogy databases that are accessible to law enforcement. The more profiles that are accessible in the databases, the greater the chance that these types of cases will be solved.